元首会晤后，中美商定保持经贸领域高层接触。
So I think the security issue, we should not overplay it. If it's overplayed, everything's a security issue.
中美经贸关系会否出现拐点？
I've argued for a long time that the United States and China have few real interest in conflict.
风云对话专访全球化智库创始人兼理事长王辉耀，副主任大卫布莱尔。中美元首会晤后，为落实元首共识，11月16日，商务部部长王文涛与美国商务部长雷蒙多在旧金山举行两国商务部沟通交流机制首次部长级会议。王文涛就美对华半导体出口管制最终规则、制裁打压中国企业、双向投资限制、301关税等表示关切。而在本次会晤前，新一轮中美经贸对话开启。国务院副总理、中美经贸中方牵头人何立峰应邀访美，期间与美财长耶伦举行数次会谈，为两国元首旧金山会晤做好经济成果准备，推动中美经贸关系回到健康稳定发展轨道。Welcome to this edition of Talk with World Leaders. I'm Nancie. Now, many believe that the recent wave of bilateral visits by high-ranking officials between China and the US are showing a sign of easing of Sino-US relations. But will the US match its words with actions to improve the relationship? Has the US shown any sincerity in removing or reducing the trade restrictions on China? And has the political climate in the US altered in its attitude towards China? Today, we have joining me online Dr. Henry Wang Huiyao, who is the founder and president of Center for China and Globalization, a leading Chinese non-governmental think tank, and Dr. David Blair, who is the vice president and senior economist at the Center for China and Globalization. Welcome online, gentlemen. Now, Dr. Blair, do you think cooperation in the economic field, is that a good entry point to regain the momentum and promote Sino-US relations?
It's a moral imperative that we cooperate. I mean, the future of the world depends on the United States and China having as good relations as possible. And I'm very glad to see the number of high-level contacts that we've been having in the last few months. I mean, as Winston Churchill had said, talk is better than war. First of all, it's partly a structural problem. In the U.S. government in Washington, the national security agencies have most of the money and most of the power. If you look at the spending that goes to the military, it dwarfs anything that goes to the Treasury. And we used to have powerful Treasury secretaries during the Reagan administration, the Bush administration. Of course, Robert Rubin during the Clinton administration was an extremely powerful person. We don't really have power. We haven't really had any powerful Treasury secretaries since Bush II administration. And Janet Yellen isn't any different. So I'm hoping we'll make progress and that economics will be a driver, but I'm a bit skeptical in any decision that has to be made that economics will overcome the power of national security bureaucracies.
Now, Dr. Blair, that actually leads on to my next question. We've seen on the same day that both China and the US officially announced the visit by Vice Premier He. Washington Post published an opinion written by Secretary Yellen saying that there is a way for the US to compete with China and to work with China. Now, Dr. Wang, how do you understand Secretary Yellen's statement?
Facing all those challenges, facing the multipolar world, facing the crisis we're having now, we need to emphasize more cooperation. And I think what Secretary Yellen has mentioned that, I mean, he emphasized the cooperation, but also he said competition. I understand the competition, probably we could compete on how we can better serve the world for the developing countries. For example, we have a Belt and Road Initiative, and the U.S. have a Build Back Better World, BCW. yeah, let's compete in a friendly way and how we can help a developing country.
I suppose the key question then is, does competition always override cooperation when it comes to areas of national security concerns? Some commentators believe many of Secretary Yellen's statements can be summarized as simply as national security first and economy second. What's your view? Now, Dr. Wang,
Well, I
perhaps.
think that, yeah, thank you. What I think actually, there is a lack of trust, I think, between China and U.S., particularly after those recent years of trade wars and all those, conflicting views. And also, as Graham Allison also put it, he hit this trap, which is not true, but is really happening probably in some of the people's mind. So I think the security issue, we should not overplay it. If it's overplayed, everything's a security issue, then we don't probably have to leave now. We really have to really build up some trust. So I really see those visits by high levels from both U.S. and China is a way to regaining the trust, to rebuild up the trust, and which is badly needed. So we have to view each other as a solutions, as a help, as cooperation, rather than view each other as rivalry, as threat, as a risk. That is fundamentally wrong.
I've argued for a long time that the United States and China have few real interests in conflict. We don't have any border disputes. We don't really have economic interests in conflict. Our two economies are too interlinked, and the areas of conflict should be very low. Unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people in Washington agree with me on that. And I see a lot of people that have an ideology. There's an ideology in both parties of asserting American primacy around the world. And it may have arisen from good motives. Say at the end of the World War II, part of the motive was, well, we need to be assertive so we don't get into another world war. We kind of need to manage the place. But I think the world has changed fundamentally. And I think eventually the United States will see that its main interests are in North America, but I hope it doesn't take a catastrophe to reach that decision point. I think the American public, we're seeing more and more, is becoming sick of these constant wars. If you look at China's development over the last 40 plus years, one of the reasons China has been so successful is that China's government has kept it out of war. It hasn't wasted all those resources and all that skill and all those people. And the U.S. has been on almost constant war for many years now, and it's been debilitating for the country. So I hope that this all works out, but I think it's going to be hard to make it happen.
Now, we've seen when Secretary Yellen visited China back in July, Vice Premier He Lifeng received her. However, her actions during her meeting sparked controversy. There was a video showing that Secretary Yellen bowed frequently when shaking hands with the Chinese Vice Premier. This seemingly humble attitude caused strong dissatisfaction among many people in the U.S. How should we interpret this kind of attitude in the U.S.?
I think the response to that is a good illustration of the kind of craziness that we see in American politics. Even many people who have otherwise sensible positions, who are in favor of let's concentrate on improving our own country, don't be the world policeman, work for peace. Still sort of at the end, they'll say, well, we need to get out of the Middle East because we need to concentrate on China. And that's a very common position all across the political spectrum. So I think this was just an opportunity for people to make fun of Yellen. I also think a lot of our leadership has not shown respect to people around the world. I mean, I think, like, if you remember a couple, maybe last year, 2 years ago, when Nancie Pelosi visited Taiwan, that was just an unnecessary sign of disrespect.
And Dr. Wang, you've been in the U.S. this year a few times. What's your impression?
Well, I think that U.S. actually, of course, among the many academics and think tanks and people business particularly, there seems to be a political correctness now rising out of the Congress, and then because the Congress, either both sides, has showed that bashing China is politically correct, and that largely because of they are really needed for the election purpose, for the voted purpose, because there is a losing class of blue collars in the Rust Belt or western part of the country, or in the general in the manufacturing sector, but then China becomes a scapegoat for that. So what I think is that we need to really address our own problem, both in China and in the U.S. We shouldn't really blame others. And I think what the Secretary Yellen come to China, paid a visit to Chinese officials, showed her grace and his respectfulness, and he's getting such a wide, good impression in China and internationally, because she's really courteous, gentle, and straightforward, and that's what we need.
Could I add to that?
Please.
Could I add one thing? I don't think that there's animosity among average Americans toward average Chinese. I don't see that at all. Working class Americans have a lot to complain about. Wages have been stagnant for more than 40 years now. Since 1979, there hasn't been an increase, and things are getting worse now. I mean, I had not been back to the United States since 2019, and I went back this summer, and things were much worse. Everything looked dirtier, run down. Prices were astonishingly high. So there's going to be a lot of complaints in that direction. I think all this is caused by domestic policies. I mean, there were policies in the financial sector and not prosecuting monopolies. Monetary policy was all basically designed to improve the positions of already wealthy people, and I don't know that they wanted to hurt the working class, but they didn't care very much. And so the people who did this will want to blame China, that's for sure, rather than say it was our own policies that caused these problems.
We've seen China and US have agreed to establish an economic working group and a financial working group. So what progress has been made in the economic field?
I think there's quite substantial progress has been made, because first of all, I think we had this high-level visit, at least of a stream of high-level visit, a ministerial ranking visit of each other. And of course, we see China has resumed actually the climate dialogue. And we see resumption of military discussion. And of course, we see the Director General of Policy Planning of both government met in Vienna just recently. And of course, on the economic front, I think there's good things. I mean, Secretary Raimondo came to Beijing. She was really overwhelmingly received by the MOFCOM and have a very large discussion. And Department of Commerce has actually canceled or withhold some of the sanctions, about 30-40 companies from its sanction list. And also we see there's a lot of talking about what it doesn't really make sense for the tariff to be added, because we have such high inflation for U.S. and the world economy, and no good for anybody. So I see there's more things that we can work together, and on the fentanyl as well, and many other things.
Sure. And Dr. Blair, with all these different exchanges and increase in communication, I mean, do you think it means the Biden administration is rethinking its China policy?
I certainly hope so. I want to reiterate what Henry said about military-to-military exchanges. I think the kind of confidence-building measures to prevent accidents, which I hope are going on, are really critical. There were several times during the Cold War where the United States and the Soviet Union almost went to war because of just an accident. There was one time there the Soviet radars were showing incoming missiles, and they were getting ready to reply, and one brave Soviet colonel stepped in and said, "This doesn't look right to me. We need to stop this. We need to not reply and see whether this is real." So I think confidence-building measures of that sort are really critical between the two countries. I also agree with the idea of person-to-person communications. You know, I grew up during the Cold War, and it's a very dangerous, very scary time. And one of my favorite songs is a song by Sting, the singer, called "I Hope the Russians Love Their Children Too." And there was almost no person-to-person contact between the West and the Soviets at the time. And that's the title of that song sounds ridiculous. It sounds silly, but it really did reflect some of the thinking at the time. So I think this kind of person-to-person relationships between students and tourists and business people and everybody going back and forth, that's really, really valuable. Because I think if Americans see the average life of Chinese, I mean, people are very friendly to me in China, almost everybody. And if they see the way people live, they have a increased understanding and increased respect for China, and vice versa. Although, unfortunately, there are a lot of Chinese who have a lot of experience in America, and very few go the other way. I heartily endorse person-to-person contacts.
从巴厘岛到旧金山，越来越多美国经贸界人士认识到，竞争绝不是两国关系的全部和主流。大量客观事实和数据凸显中美社会联系之密，利益交融之深。在不久前圆满落幕的第6届进博会上，超过200家美国企业来到上海，数量创历届进博会之最。很多参展企业代表表示，希望高层对话为双边经贸关系和世界经济复苏提供更多确定性。The 6th China International Import Expo, the CIIE, this is being held in Shanghai, and the US had sent the largest delegation to Shanghai to participate in the CIIE. Now, what kind of attitude do you think that reflects on the US business's attitude towards Sino-US Economic and Trade Cooperation? Dr. Wang, please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I just got back from Shanghai Import Expo, and I see Ambassador Nick Burns was at opening, and he said we don't seek a decoupling from China, which is great, to hammer that message again and again. And I see all those big companies are coming back. Micron first time had a huge boost there. We see, AMD was there in a big way, and we see Qualcomm was there. We see all those semiconductor companies are there. I mean, it's really silly, for US to say, okay, we don't want to sell to China, and we have a CHIPS Act or CHIP 5 or whatever alliance. But that doesn't really make sense. I'm glad that US is relaxing South Korea semiconductor companies selling to China. I hope they do relaxing for the US company, for the Dutch companies and Japanese companies, because this is really good for their business. It represents 40%, 30 to 40% of their business. So if they can't sell to China, and then they're going to lose their R&D capacity, they're losing their extra money to support their folks back home, which is no good. And so I think, and also that forced China to do it on its own. Normally, China should buy in that. For example, China spent more money buying the chips than buying petroleum energy, which China 70% of energy depends on import. You can see how big is the buyer from China. So I think there is attending the expo by both U.S. government and U.S. business community is send a strong signal to back to the U.S. China is still by far the best market potential. I'm sure the U.S. business has already fed up with this kind of sanctions and decoupling and de-risk what kind of those policy, and they really want to do more business, and that should probably will be reflected into the election sometime.
Sure. Now, during exchanges with high-level U.S. officials, China has repeatedly raised concerns over the Section 301 tariffs. Now, the U.S. has up to now included more than 1,300 Chinese companies on various sanction lists. Are Chinese companies investing in the U.S., are they being treated fairly? How should the U.S. respond to China's concerns over the tariffs?
You have to look at local governments and local and state governments and the national government. The local and state governments are very welcoming of any kind of investment from China or from anywhere else because they're mostly interested in jobs. But as I've been saying, there's a lot of dispute within the national government about what to do, and there are people who are more economically oriented and more people who are more national security oriented. And so you really don't know how that's going to turn out, but the national security people win most of the time. There's a term which goes around in Washington a lot called the economic instrument of power. And the idea is, how do we use economics as a tool of statecraft, basically? So that's led to a lot of these sanctions. It also led to other things such as using the financial system and the role of the dollar to try to put pressure on countries around the world. One thing that's happened recently is we put huge sanctions on Russia recently, and they don't seem to be working. They don't seem to be achieving what the Americans or the Europeans wanted them to achieve. So maybe that will tell people that this isn't a very powerful instrument and you need to stop it. But I hope so. I agree with Joe Nye that it's going to take 10 or 15 years to change attitudes in the United States and in Europe. The United States and Europe have spent a long time in the world being dominant, and they don't want to give up that position easily. Although it's been very, very harmful for our populations. The wars and even the role of the dollar have been very harmful for the U.S. average person, but they haven't had enough power to stop it or enough understanding to stop it. We see some recognition that might be changing, but I think the next 10 years will be particularly dangerous when sort of the policy-making elites start to realize that the world has changed and that we should really be concerned mostly with how to improve the position of our own people rather than trying to improve the nation's dominance in the world.
How do you evaluate the current business environment for U.S. companies operating in China?
I think over especially the last 5 or so years, the Chinese central government is taking a huge number of steps to make foreign companies equal with Chinese companies within China. Legally, they're completely equal. I think China is a huge market and everybody wants to be here. Sometimes you get a lot of complaints because a lot of the Western companies are used to operating in highly oligopolistic or monopolistic markets, and they can't stand the competition in China.
Next year, we all know, is the election year in the U.S. Now, what does it mean for Sino-U.S. relations?
I think the next year is going to be a really crazy year in the United States. Potentially a lot of political upsets of one kind or another. The latest poll I saw from this weekend showed President Trump receiving 30% of the votes, in polling at 36% favorable. President Biden at 31%, and amazingly, Robert Kennedy Jr. at 25%. That's going to really upset politics. The Biden administration is likely to do anything to try to stop either Trump or Robert Kennedy Jr. from winning. I don't know what's going to happen there, but it could be a potentially very crazy year. I mean, you could see the Biden administration is denying Secret Service protection to Robert F. Kennedy, and if he's shot or assassinated or something, it's going to cause tremendous turmoil within the country. You don't know. There's a significant portion of the population who wants a tremendous change in foreign policy. I mean, Robert Kennedy's position is he will abolish the CIA on his first day in office because he believes they killed his uncle, and John Kennedy, and potentially his father. And he plans to cut the defense budget by half. So that would be a tremendous change in the world. I don't know that's going to happen, but it shows there's a significant portion of the American population that wants big change.
Lots of uncertainty and could be a very crazy year. And Dr. Wang, do you have anything to add?
I think this is going to see a much more polarized society in the US and sometimes in other countries too. I think that's the challenge that the U.S. public should be facing with, and then trying to see how we can improve our own domestic policies. How can we improve our system? And China should do the same. China has those types of many challenges, headaches for transforming the society forward. Every country has its own challenges, and we really should deal with each other own problem challenges. People also say in the U.S., China is collapsing, but China is not. China is still vibrant and prosperous. And then, look at all the numbers. China has 70% of global 5Gs. China has 2/3 of global speed railways. Out of the 10 largest container ports, 7 of them are in China. China is really squarely in a value chain, global supply chain center. And that's why all the multinationals want to come to China for 500 million middle class, the largest in the world. So there's no reason, we are not seeing China as a blessing to the world, rather than seeing China as a threat. And ideologically, they think China is a different system, but China has a meritocracy practiced for thousands of years. China each year, the 12 million college entrants, people have the right examination paper voting into the college. 2 million students writing the examination paper voting into the government system. The selection and election are all combined. And so we have to really recognize China has a system. If China can do it, it must have done something right. And we should not demonize China. I think also we should not demonize US too. So let's really work with each other and find a way to peacefully accept each other and for the better benefit of the world.